Good morning, everybody. I'm Kay Dowling, the President of the Friends of the Museum, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the first of our Oral Histories of Northern Tasmania, Our People, Their Stories. This is a new rebranding of our popular morning coffee lecture, and I don't know about you, but I'm having trouble just getting used to the title. It's been such a popular event, and I think it's stuck in our minds. I'd like to acknowledge that we've got so many members who are regular attendees at our lecture, some new members and new faces, and we encourage you to come along every month as we unwind stories of our community. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Tasmanian Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge also the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional owners and continuing custodians of the land where we meet today. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Ella Dixon, who is a long-time friend of mine. We first met in 2006 when we were both working for the City of Launceston on the It's About Us program, and we discovered we had a few other things in common. Firstly, we've got the same birth date, and the second, although she's a lot younger than me, I'm afraid, and the second is that we shared an experience of living in Circular Head for 12 years, well, for me it was 12 years, but in the 1980s. Ella's gone on to develop her career in management. She's worked extensively in community and economic development and in women's policy areas for the State Department of Premier and Cabinet. She has a wonderful story to tell, and it will provide an extraordinary contrast, I think, to other stories of migrants to our community. We have a good record in our series of lectures of people who came here post-war, but Ella will provide another aspect to this story, and I think it's the power of our program, having gone for 30 years, that we're now starting to find contrasts and comparisons that we can make with the information we hear on these talks. Will you please join me in welcoming Ella, because I think she's the person to tell her story.
Thank you, Kay, and good morning. I usually start off my talks with, "Can you see me?" Because I'm because I am very short. However, I am Filipino and I love shoes. So today I'm wearing my tall shoes, so I can see you. Thank you, Kay, for the invitation. And firstly, also, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm delighted to be here for the first one. You didn't tell me I was the first one. And then I saw Frank at the door and I thought, my goodness. And but it is a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to share you my story and also my family story. But in doing so, weaving some of the things that we experience in my workplace at the Migrant Resource Centre, Northern Tasmania. Some of you probably know what we do there. However, I will cover that in my talk today. Preparing for this talk took me on a trip down memory lane, and some things resurfaced for me. I giggled, I got teary-eyed, and I laughed a little bit as I tried to look for photographs, and I also reflected on the experiences that some of the clients that I see on a daily basis might be experiencing. I will never profess to say that I know what a refugee story might be like, because that wasn't our experience. However, I do know what it's like to be new in a place, what it's like to not be accepted at first, and also what it takes to be accepted, and moving from that tolerance to being accepted in a community. I love Tasmania and I will call it home and I will retire here. So I'm very pleased. So I've divided my talk into 4 sections. The first bit is my family's journey to Tasmania from the Philippines. The sadness and the excitement of immigrating, the things that happened in those first few years, the funny stories that I usually tell at some of these talks that we come to. We were the only Asians in the village when we arrived in the early 80s in Smithton. I grew up in 2 cultures, but really when I was doing this preparation, I thought I grew up in 3 cultures, because there's my Filipino culture, there is the Australian culture that I entered, And then there's my own culture, which is a mix of both the Filipino and the Australian culture. So I'll cover a little bit of that and what that's meant for me. And also the journey to my job that I have today, which I think I'm so lucky that in a little place like Launceston, I get to work with so many cultures, and also to work in an organisation that has a heart and an organisation that has purpose. I'm very, very lucky. So firstly, who am I? I was born in the Philippines in a city that never sleeps. As you saw in my bio, when we came here in the early 1980s, the population of Manila, which is the city that I was in, had 11.5 million people. I am the youngest of two to a loving mother. Her name's Myrma, and some of you might know her actually. She's a bit of a stalwart and a bit famous. And a father who went overseas when I was 9 months old in search of a better life and was to return for us. But sadly, or perhaps not sadly, he didn't come back for us. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. I'm married to Darren, and together we have 3 children. We're a Brady Bunch, blended family. I have one daughter, Rochelle, who's 26, and I have spotted her, one of her principals from primary school, Miss Corbett. And 2 sons, Lee, 37, and Otis, who's 35. Darren and I, coincidentally, are also both from the Northwest Coast. I do believe everyone in this room must have a connection to the Northwest. I think everyone has some kind of connection there. Darren is an accountant with a small practice in Invermay. Rochelle lives in Melbourne and the boys live in Devonport. I'm a grandmother of the cutest little human being, and I'm sure all grandmothers say this about their grandchildren, to Sonny, who was born in May 2020. So in his 10 months, I've only seen him 3 times, which is a bit tragic. My plan was to go and see him every 6 weeks, fly, because that was quite easy. But obviously the pandemic had different plans for me. But nevertheless, still happy that I get to see him on FaceTime every day, and I will see him for his first birthday. So I'm what you would call a 2nd generation migrant. I call my mum the 1st generation. I'm 2nd generation, Rochelle's 3rd, and now Sonny's the 4th generation. Like I said before, my mum, my sister and I left the Philippines for Tasmania in 1981. And my first trip back would be nearly 10 years later. And when Rochelle was born, I was determined that I wouldn't do that I wanted her to learn about my heritage and to see what it's like to be Filipino, because I wanted her to be part Filipino. Even though her dad is Australian, I wanted her to know what it's like to be Filipino and so she can see the values and the characteristics of what it is to be Filipino. I can speak Tagalog, which is the native tongue in the Philippines, the most common language there. But my vocabulary is that of an 11-year-old, because what happened was, for the first couple of years, we would speak to mum in Tagalog. However, as though I wanted to be normal and I wanted to ditch my accent, we stopped talking to mum in Tagalog, which is one of the sadness that I feel. And my daughter reminds me that I shouldn't have done that to her either. But I would not have been a good teacher to her in any case because my vocabulary was so bad. So I'm now going to show you a couple of photos and then I'll move on to the next part. Some of you might know some very well-known Filipinos. We're a bit notorious for characters. So, you like the shoes? Yes, I like the shoes. So the Marcos, they're probably the most famous Filipinos that no introductions required. And then the Aquino family as well. So Cory Aquino was the first female president of the Philippines. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. The other one who's really famous is the boxer. And now you know what? His name escaped me. Manny Pacquiao. That's it, the boxer. And many people know him as well. And of course, who wouldn't know this current president, President Duterte, who at the moment is quite popular, would you believe? In speaking to my family members back home, people love him. People love having an authoritarian for a change, because what's happening in the Philippines is quite a decaying element in society there. So he's cleaning up the country. He's dealing with the drug problem, apparently, and also trying to deal with the pandemic in the best way that he can in a country with so many people. This is the photo that you saw in my bio and in the flyer that was distributed. So that was taken when I was 2 years old. I'm the one sitting down on the round chair on the front, and my sister, my mum, and my grandfather, who's sadly not with us anymore. The reason I love this photo so much is because that grandfather clock reminds me so much of my childhood. And it's probably, I was going back to get that when I grew up, but it's no longer there. And it's again, a great tragedy for me in that one of the things that represented my childhood is no longer there. Here's another photo of us a little bit older. And that was about 2 years prior to us leaving the Philippines. This was my school. I went to a primary school from grade 1 to grade 6, so it was a private school. And it was an all-girls school, and the class was 50 children at a time. So we went on the morning shift, so we'd get up quite early in the morning. I would be home by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then the afternoon shift of students would then come in. That school had more people in it than Smith did. So it was really, as you can probably start to build a picture as what it might have been like for us when we first went to Smithton High School. And this is my mum and dad when we went on a cruise, pre-pandemic. And this is, I don't have any photos of our very first few months in Tasmania. However, this is the life that we had, and it was wonderful. We had a pet lamb called Lucy. I saw my very first cow ever, and got to ride a tractor, got to drive a tractor, and I never knew what hay was. So these things are things that I only ever saw on TV. So it was delightful to be able to see them firsthand. This is a picture of myself and Rochelle. This is a bit of a story of how we got to Brady Bunch. So unfortunately, I'm a second timer, and Rochelle and I lived together for quite a while until I met Darren through a friend at a family barbecue. And so we decided that this probably could work. In fact, it worked for my parents. Why couldn't it work for me? And this was just some of the shots that we visited, some of the places that we visited, and that's our little Brady Bunch there. So there are 5 of us, myself and Darren, myself and Rochelle, and then the 5 of us. And that was taken quite a while back because despite that we're all here in Australia, we still don't get together that much as a fivesome. It's very much the boys and us, or Rochelle and us. We are now empty nesters. Like I said, Rochelle's moved to Melbourne and the 2 boys no longer live with us as well. I love it. Some people get teary-eyed when they say, oh, the kids are moving out. I absolutely adore it. Sure, you miss the children and you miss the things. You miss things like, what's for dinner, Mum? And you miss the busyness that a household with children gives you. However, I do enjoy and I cherish the moments that they are home. But sometimes I think, when are you going home? I just really want to. So Rochelle is a fashion designer. So she did her degree in Melbourne, which is why she's in Melbourne. Lee is a radio announcer. So he's on CFM. Some of you might have known him. He started his career here at City Park Radio and then went on to LAFM. And then he and his partner moved to Devonport. And our middle child, Otis, he still hasn't quite worked out what he wants to do. However, he is a musician. He's very talented. He can pick up a piece of instrument and play just by hearing a piece of music. And this is just the design that Rochelle graduated with at White House. And I'm proud to say that she graduated top 12 in the nation when she graduated in whatever year that was now. It seems like such a long time ago. She was one of those kids who wanted to have a gap year. And I said to her, no way, unless you find a full-time job, you're not going to stop. And I said, if you haven't found anything, I want you to find another course. She started a one-year university degree at university in Bachelor of Commerce because she wanted to be chip off the old block. She wanted to be like Darren, and found that that wasn't her thing. She doesn't like numbers that much. She couldn't see herself sitting in an office, dealing with clients, and she used to do some part-time work in Darren's practice. So she got a first-hand experience of what that was like. So I was really pleased that she met somebody who introduced her to the White House School of Design and finished a degree in fashion. So just stepping away from my personal story, I'll tell you a little bit about the Migrant Resource Centre. So the Migrant Resource Centre is a medium-sized not-for-profit, and our main game is to settle people who come as migrants or people who come under the humanitarian program. The people that we see are people from, at the moment, Bhutan, Sudan, Afghanistan, Congo, Nepal, Sierra Leone. And so as you can imagine, many stories. The people that we welcome are people who are what people call the offshore process refugees. So they have to have registered as a refugee and be accepted by Australia to come here. The MRC has a broad service provision with an overarching goal of independence. So all our programs are about individual and group capacity building, enabling people to navigate systems so that they can do things for themselves. So for example, we have a multicultural playgroup, which brings mums together to talk about some of the issues that they may be finding difficult in a new life. We have a driver mentoring program, and that allows us to help people to get their licenses. And we have Karen Lay in the audience, who was the long-time driver mentoring program coordinator. And she really is the reason why it's been such a success and still continues today. Thank you, Karen. And just a little plug, if you're looking to teach somebody how to drive, we're always looking for volunteers. It's not for everyone, however, you might consider helping somebody make some friends by teaching them how to drive. We also run employment and training pathways programs where we develop programs in sectors where there might be jobs for people. And we do some accredited training and non-accredited training, put people in workplaces so they can have first-hand experience, because one of the things that new arrivals experience here is that no one will give them a chance because they have no workplace experience. So that's one of the things that we do, is to open up some of those opportunities, introduce people to local business people, to people who might be employers, to just give them a chance. We also host events like Harmony Day, and I'm hoping that some of you might have been able to make it last Friday. I know our ambassador, Dr. Frank Medill, made it down there, and it's it used to be an annual event to celebrate multiculturalism and also to celebrate diversity in Launceston. It was a little bit scaled back this year, however, it was still quite a lot of fun. We also assist people to pass citizenship. So after 4 years, people can apply to be citizens of Australia. And a lot of our caseworkers work with people to help them practice the exam and teach them how they might progress to the next stage, because citizenship really is, for some people, for most people, the final step in becoming an Australian. And it's a very, very special thing to do. We also have held special projects like the Community Kitchen, which was a partnership between the Migrant Resource Centre and Inveresk Tavern, where our clients would take over the kitchen for Sunday service. We did that for 3 years, and we ran that pretty much on the side of a couple of people's desks, and it was highly successful and thankfully recognised by the City of Launceston as the Community Event of the Year 1 year. When I applied for this job, it felt right. And in my heart, I knew that I could make a positive contribution, given my experience as a migrant, but also because I identify as an Australian. I also thought I could give back to the communities meaningfully. And using my experiences, my qualifications, my contacts in government and in community, I thought it would be a useful thing to do. And in fact, I was thinking of applying for it another time before this last. However, we still had Rochelle at home, and I didn't think I could warrant having such a busy job and having children at home. At the time also, I was finishing my master's at university. So there was too much going on. And in fact, I'm really pleased that I got this job when I did, because I felt personally I was at the right life stage and also at the right frame of mind to take something on like this. Because I can tell you that my role as CEO is probably the hardest, but also the most rewarding job I've ever had. I feel really, really fortunate and privileged to have been given this opportunity to be a part, as I said before, to be a part of somewhere where I get to hang out with people who are culturally diverse, linguistically diverse, and to be in an organisation that has a big heart. We have around 90 volunteers that help us to carry out the work that we do. And I think that's testament to the people before me, the people who established our MRC back in 1982. I'm just showing you some more photos now, just to break it up a little bit. So this is Rochelle Lincoln, Smooch, the little one-eyed pug, and Sonny, when he was about 6 weeks old, which was the first time I met him. We now have 4 generations, which is quite unusual for Filipinos. The life expectancy of Filipinos usually sees only about 3 generations. So it's very, very amazing, really, for us now to have 4 generations here. Very special. That's just the grandparents going all mushy on the cute grandchild, because he is rather cute, don't you think? Yes. And that's him at 10 months old. And I think he's going to be a future CEO. Yes. Yes, he does. He does. Before I go on about my family, how my family ended up here, let me set the scene for you and tell you a little bit about the Philippines. The history books will tell you that the Philippines is about 67,000 years old. It's a relatively young nation compared to Japan and China, but in comparison to Tasmania, like Kay said, it's about us, was only 2000. It's quite an old nation. It was first discovered by the Spanish in 1521. It had been invaded and occupied by Americans and then the Japanese. And while the country gained independence each time, these occupations have shaped and continue to shape the Philippines and its peoples. Because of this history, the Filipinos generally have a sort of a revolutionary tradition, if you like. They have enduring patience, they're heroic people. With that also, they have a colonized mind, a condition that some Filipinos are afflicted with: apathy, self-induced ignorance, and it's not really a surprise given the country's history, and not having a strong sense of identity because of all these countries that have invaded and occupied and influenced the way they live. An example of and common practice of this colonial mentality that I'm talking about is when we go to the Philippines and see the entertainment and the beauty industries in the Philippines. They favour people with light skin. In the Philippines, I'm considered dark-skinned. And my sister, who for some reason, she's a little bit lighter than me, she was the pretty one. And she used to always say that to me. And she would be introducing herself, "Hi, this is me, this is my sister, and I'm the pretty one," she would say, because she had the lighter skin. It's a little bit like what I guess people will now consider the Michael Jackson thing, in that light skin is celebrated. So the Filipinos are the same. When you walk through the supermarket aisles, you will see skin whitening lotions, skin whitening soaps, and everything that's on the promotional material on TV are people who don't look 100% Filipino. They're a mix of cultures. So, and that's the Spanish influence, because that's what's celebrated there. That's what's considered beautiful in that culture. In a similar way that we think here that skinny and tan is beautiful. In the Philippines, it's having light skin. Filipinos are also quite sensitive. I'm sure a lot of other cultures are as well. But I find, and this, by the way, these are my observations as a person who came here as an 11-year-old and has gone back regularly. Candidness and candor is a bit missing in the culture of the Filipinos. But they're also a grateful people, and ingratitude is one of the most sinful things that you can commit as a Filipino. Indebtedness, or a sense of indebtedness, is a big thing. If somebody does something for you, you're almost forever indebted to that person, no matter how small the deed is. And some of you who might know some Filipinos will probably understand this. Once a friend, always a friend, because that's just the way the culture is. Filipinos are flamboyant, they're open, and they're hospitable to a fault. Some of them are also great show-offs. Again, as you saw, the Marcuses, the shoes, the flash cars, the boxer who drives around in really flash cars, the actors. It's a little bit Hollywood, if you know what I mean, and I think it is a little bit of the American influence on the culture, which is why we see it like that. Another noticeable characteristic is that Filipinos cannot stand empty space and silence. Quiet equals sad. And this will become clearer now. So I looked up the other night the current population of the Philippines. It's now, as at March 20, it was 110 million people. Nearly 111 million people, in fact. And the Philippines population is always on the upward trend. It's not unlike Tasmania's trend is always sort of hovering or plateauing or going down. The Philippines, because being a Catholic country as well, they produce a lot of babies. It's very, very uncommon to have single children families. Even 2 children is unusual. The population projection in 2050 is 144.5 million people. And if you consider that the Philippines is only 4.5 times the size of Tasmania, that's a lot of people in a little space. So the Philippines ranks number 13 in the list of countries by population, whereas Australia is ranked 55 with a population of 25.5 million people. Globally, the population density is 58.7 inhabitants per square kilometre. In the Philippines, it's 368 people per square kilometre. In Australia, it's 3, and in Tasmania, it's 8 people per square kilometre. So you can see why it is that quiet equals sad. Filipinos are used to noise. They're used to being around each other. Personal space is not a thing they value. In fact, they're frightened of it. I remember when my auntie came out, and we were sort of trying to get her to stay here, but she lasted 6 months. Because mum and dad both went to work, my sister and I went to school, she would be at home on a country road by herself, and she would lock herself in the room and be frightened every time the cow said moo. It was really dreadful for her. It was very, very lonely existence. So she ended up going back to a house with 8 people, 2 bedrooms and 8 people. The Philippines is an archipelago of about 7,000 islands with a total land area, like I said before, that 4.5 times larger than Tasmania. About half of the population live in urban settings. Again, a clue as to why Filipinos like crowds and parties and things like that. The median age is 25.7 years old. In Australia, it's 37.2, and in Tasmania, it's 41.2. So they don't suffer from the aging population that we do here. And while Philippines is one of the tiger economies in Asia, it's also very, very poor. There's a growing middle class, but with that many people, there just aren't enough opportunities for everybody to thrive. Education is highly valued because it's one of the ways to get out. It's a ticket out. The country is overpopulated, and many Filipinos become overseas workers. Speaking to Jill earlier about cruises and people who have been traveling a lot, you will know that there are a lot of Filipinos working around the world. I think it's about 10 million people, 10 million Filipinos working in hospitality, in maritime, because that's what they do. Because even those jobs, they're better off doing that than being at home, even though they're qualified engineers and nurses and physios. They are better off working overseas. So for me, the things that are distinctly Filipino: religious people, it's a highly Catholic environment. Education is valued. People laugh a lot. They say thank you a lot. And as I've said before, they're sort of hostess with the mostess. They love to entertain and they love to serve people. They love to be in this servitude mode. That's one of those things I didn't pick up, as my husband is very disappointed. The other thing that Filipinos have is this, apart from the colonial mentality, is also the scarcity mentality. They're always saving for a rainy day, or they'll save a little bit to prepare for the future. I gave you that background because each race, to some extent, is defined by its environment, and I'll weave that into those couple of snippets of what it's like to be a Filipino. And in my work, I know that when we know and understand where somebody comes from, some things become less baffling. For, like I said before, in Australia, we're surrounded by water. People love to swim, and therefore we produce champion swimmers. Another example is that the Japanese live in the constant state of preparedness, and isn't it a surprise when they are sitting on a tectonic plate and there's always an earthquake? I also gave you that background to be able to start to build a picture of growing up in a different culture and in a different environment. My family in the Philippines would have been considered middle class. My biological father was an accountant, and I mentioned that about Darren because isn't it funny how history repeats itself? They say you marry your father. Well, I'm lucky though. I think that's about the extent of the similarities. So my father was quite popular by all accounts. He was climbing the corporate ladder. My mum didn't have to work, and she was raising myself and my sister with my grandfather who lived with us. We even had a nanny and a housemaid. When I was 9 months old, my father took off to the US to look for a better life, and he found it all right, but with someone else. And when I was 2 years old, the marriage ended. He maintained contact for a few years, but I have really no recollection of any phone calls. My mum has kept a couple of cards, birthday cards that he sent, but apart from that, really, I don't know him. It wasn't until 2012 that I met my father for the first time, and I got to spend 1 hour with him. He lived in California. So we're on our way to somewhere. My husband kind of just stopped and said, "Would you like to visit your father?" So I said yes. Unfortunately, like I said, that was the first and only time that I saw my biological father. And look, it doesn't matter because the only father that I know is the one that lives in Smithton, that's John Kelly. My mum then had to find herself a job. She was an executive secretary for a British engineering firm, and she was earning enough to support us, including renting a decent apartment and sending us to that private school. Now, my mum is extraordinary. She's good at budgeting and she's good at saving, but she wasn't a miracle worker. As we got older and the cost of living rose, it became increasingly difficult for her to provide for all of us. And there was 1 year we moved 10 times. And it's only now that I understand it was because Mum could not make ends meet. So our house got smaller and smaller and smaller. And also we were looking for places that were close to the school because school was so important to my mum that she would rather we lived in a small apartment and kept going to the same school than to find a nice house and go to a public school. That's the extent that she went to make sure that we were catered for. So being a divorcee back then, it's really hard. It's hard now, but it was even harder back then. And when the support from my biological father stopped, Mum came to the realization that perhaps too she should be looking overseas for a better future for us. When I was about 9, she started writing to a friend in Tasmania, who was then introduced to my mum by a friend of a friend. We met this pen friend a couple of times when he came to Manila, and that pen friend was my dad, John Kelly. And he is the only dad that I've ever known. And it is because of this friendship that flourished that we set off to Tasmania 2 years later when I was 11. I have to admit, I didn't like John Kelly at first. He was funny looking. He spoke with a funny accent. Some of you will know that Filipinos speak with an American accent. So you can imagine us meeting this man who was a stranger and speaking in an accent that we didn't recognize. Despite attending an English-speaking school, we couldn't understand him. It was all a bit sign language, like, yes, and a lot of nodding and just smiling at him. I also wasn't used to seeing having a man around my mum. So for me, there was a protective thing that was going on at that time. Anyway, I was really the hard one to convince. But 2 years later and regular letters, I got to see the gentle and caring and generous person that's my dad. I want my grandchildren, great-grandchildren and future generations to know that my connection to Tasmania and that their connection to Tasmania started off with this decision by two people, my mum and my dad, to take a chance at love and family again. We're here because of them. We live a blessed life because of them, and for that I will be forever grateful. I remember the day when mum announced that we would be coming to Australia. We were excited. We were leaving many relatives, and I remember lots of farewell lunches and things like that. But the hardest part for me was leaving my grandfather behind. He had been a constant in my life. He was a strong male and a strong influence, and I adored him. The plan was we would get settled and bring him over for a visit. If I'd known that we wouldn't see him again when we left, I would have hugged him a little harder and a little longer. Oops, sorry, this is my emotional reaction to that. Now, we didn't have many possessions to sort before departing. Like I said, we'd pretty much downsized to one pair of shoes for school, one pair of shoes for church. And we had very few personal belongings, very few photo albums. And our most prized possessions were a TV, that grandfather clock that you saw on the flyer, and also some photos in a frame, which we took out and put in our suitcases. We left the Philippines with only 3 suitcases and carry-on bags. We left so many possessions behind. No toys, nothing like that. I had a pack of school books that I took to my mum's friend's house, and I said, I'm coming back for these because I want something from my childhood when I come back. That got flooded and I wasn't able to get it. Back in 1981, there was no MRC in Smithton. Smithton didn't have any support services for migrants, and my father only had his mum and a couple of siblings who lived in Wynyard. So we didn't really have a support network to call on. And I think my mum was befriended by a couple of women from the Country Women's Association, and I love the Country Women's Association. And it's a story that probably I had forgotten while I was doing this talk, until I was doing this talk. The last place that my grandfather, my mum, my sister and I lived in was a tiny place with 1 bedroom, and we were surrounded by neighbours. My sister, mum and I shared a bedroom, and my grandfather slept on the floor in the sort of kitchen lounge area. And a bathroom and toilet didn't have running water. Each morning we had to fetch and store enough water for the day from a communal tap before going to school. Dad used to write to us and say what life would be like in Tasmania. We were moving to a 4-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms, running water, a farm with 200 cows. He said that he had a couple of cars, a couple of tractors, and no neighbours to look at. It was a life I could not imagine. And it sounded like a grand adventure. We'd never been on a plane before, my sister and I. My mum had. My sister and I hadn't been on a plane before, never seen a cow before. And the thought of not having to fetch water and not having to share a bedroom with my sister was even a bit frightening for me. What I wasn't and couldn't possibly be prepared for is knowing how to grow up in a different culture and how living and growing up in 2 worlds can create issues of identity and belonging, that there's this transition, loss and unresolved grief. Again, it's something that I see on a day-to-day basis in the work that I do. Anyone here watch The Golden Girls? Yes, fabulous show. Picture this, 1981, Smithton. It was the month of April, and unbeknown to us, there was a pilot strike in Australia when we arrived. The adventure had started a little bit too soon for us because what we found in Melbourne was there were no flights to Tasmania. To cut a long story short, a man from Ulverston overheard the desperation in my mum's voice and offered us seats on the flight that he was chartering to Smithton. And that's how we got here. It was a 6-seater plane on a rainy, dark night. We were scared, and we could almost hear my mum saying to herself, my goodness, what have I done? The flight was rough, and I remember my head was in the sick bag all the way to Smithton. And it was the longest 50 minutes I've ever experienced. Luckily, Dad was there to greet us, beaming. When he saw us, we were all crying, and I think it was just relief. We hopped in his car for what seemed another 50 minutes to drive home to a place called Britton Swamp. I honestly thought that we were in a horror movie. It, it was so dark and there were no street lights. Mum was speaking to us in Tagalog, trying her best to sound upbeat, but she was very scared as well. So we were the only Asians in the village in Smithton at that time, apart from some Chinese nationals who ran the Chinese restaurant. We were it. And in coming from multi-million sort of metropolitan city that was Manila to a population of 7,000, we stood out. And I still remember the first day we went to Emmett Street, which is the main street of Smithton, and feeling the stares of the locals and a couple of people yelling out different things. So as you can imagine, as with many new arrivals, there was a period of adjustment. New language, new people, not many people who look like us, and a very different way of living. Cold weather was the new thing that added to our daily tumble of disorientation. I'd never worn a jumper before. Wool made me itchy. And it was sort of the things that felt scratchy, and it just, my mum had an allergic reaction to wearing different clothing. We struggled really to make sense of this new world, and as a family, we experienced quite a bit of generational and cultural conflicts through our teenage years. I say to the parents that I see now, all teenagers are terrible, no matter what culture they're from. They're all horrible, so me included, me included. My sister and I attended Smithton High School, which was a really scary experience. It was so much smaller than what we were used to. And more frighteningly so, I had to hang out with boys because we never had to deal with that. I went to an all-girls school. Like many migrant parents, Mum tried to hold on to her traditional Filipino and Catholic ways that she brought to Australia. It was therefore inevitable that we would clash. There were differences of opinions and perspectives with her teenage daughters growing up with Western and very liberal values. We were desperate to be normal, and Mum was drowning with this vast cultural gap that existed between her values and those that she confronted in her new homeland. No sleepovers, no parties. Discussions about having a boyfriend always ended up in an argument. Participating in school activities was foreign to my mum. School production practice after school socials made her nervous. The school camp had my mother sleepless for a week. And worst of all, Mum found it really hard to feel comfortable enough to talk to other parents because she was also dealing with a new life. Despite all that, I have fond and not so fond memories of our first few years in Tasmania. We all loved farm life, milking, hay carting, driving tractors, gumboots, everything. It was all a new experience for all us city slickers. So it was wonderful. Most of the locals were friendly, but there were a few who weren't so welcoming at first. When we arrived, Pauline Hanson had just risen to some kind of popularity. So I even remember us following a school bus one day in our early days, and a student had put up a sign, "Go back to where you came from." That was part of the sadness that we sort of thought, what's happening here? We've never experienced racism before. But then when we went to school, we also discovered that there were some people who just weren't used to diversity. The names I've been called include darky, monkey, bloody Asian, that was a common one, chink. And the kids would ask me if I like fried lice. They're really cruel things that I think made me a bit stronger and a bit more resilient these days, because I know now and I can also understand where that comes from. I was in grade 7 when we entered Smithton High School. So by grade 8, really, I had probably lost a little bit of my accent. I was elected as a school counsellor, and in grade 10, I was prefect. So I feel like I was accepted in a short time. My mum, on the other hand, found it difficult to land a job in her field, although we all spoke in English. Her heavily accented speech was a bit quirky for some employers. She went to 21 interviews in 1 year and did not get a job. And she ended up picking broccoli and potatoes in the forest in Forest Stanley. So my Australian upbringing has given me a number of things that I like. And what I've done growing up cross-culturally is chosen bits and pieces of the things I like about being a Filipino and things that I love about being Australian. So being Australian, I've learned individualism, independence, how to be more assertive. I have a different view on education, and hence my going to uni a bit later in life, because it wasn't just about going to university, getting a degree and doing a job that I didn't like, because I wanted to be a lawyer, and I'm really pleased that I didn't go down that path. As an Australian, I also have first world problems, which I find amusing. I'm a little bit more punctual than some of my Filipino friends. And now instead of having a mentality of scarcity like Filipinos have, I have a mentality of abundance. And I think that comes from the fact that I know I can live with a lot less. I can live in a corner that's smaller than that corner over there. I don't need a toilet. I can go and get water. I know what it's like not to have food. So I think that all those strengths and resilience has been brought about because of my experiences back home. It is really hard growing up in two cultures because when people say to me things like, where are you from? I struggle with that question. In fact, my husband went to a school reunion in Burnie. He went to Burnie High School. And the most common thing I was asked, because I seemed to be the only Asian person in the room, was, where are you from? And I have these funny little experiments with myself. And I just said, Launceston. Most people are really quite disappointed with that and couldn't cope. But I love it. I love doing that to people because it's a little mind game that I play. Look, there are some things that are very Australian that I do. I love the beach. My mouth waters at the thought of a lamb roast. I celebrate Australia Day. I volunteer for charitable causes. And I've done things like I've been on the board of guide dogs. I've done playgroup, parents and friends help and those kinds of things. And I was one of those people who had a gap year as well. So that's very Australian. But I'm also un-Australian in many ways. I still can't for the life of me enjoy Vegemite. It smells good and it does look like it should be enjoyable, but I'm not like that. I'm not a fan of football or cricket, and I only chose my footy team because of the colours that I like. I'm also still very sensitive about practical jokes, but thankfully my husband Darren is from a huge family and he's kind of knocked that out of me by now. I'm a little less sensitive than I used to be. I am Australian though, that's what my passport shows, and that's where I was raised. This is where I was raised and studied, and this is where I pay my taxes. I was born Filipino to Filipino parents, but I don't hold dual citizenship. But part of my heart will always live in the Philippines because it's my other home. In fact, when we plan trips to Manila, my mum always says, we're going home. We have very strong connections there. I still have, I think, 1,000 cousins there. And that's where my grandparents are buried. And every time we go there, I make a point of going to the cemetery to say hello. Some days I miss the Philippines, and it's not just an idle thought. It's really a deep sense and an aching for a place that I like to belong. I was reading a book called Third Culture Kids, and I loved it because the book is about young people growing up among worlds, and it included a category of kids like myself. So cross-cultural immigrants born overseas, grew up in a different culture. I fell into a couple of other categories like child to parents from a biracial home and a child of minorities. Finally, I had a title. I was a cross-cultural kid because I couldn't work it out before then. I was relieved. But growing up as a cross-cultural kid also posed issues to me. I felt like I didn't belong to either one. And I didn't find that cultural balance for a long time and wondered what was wrong with me because I never seemed to get it. No matter what situation I was in or how hard I tried, I often found myself making what others saw as a silly remark, an awkward mistake, or feeling like shameful because I was a little bit out of sync socially. I was a little bit awkward for a while there. Some examples is not quite hitting the mark with the clothes that I wore. My mum dressed us so terribly in high school. That's her fault. And I had some issues with that. I still have troubles with proverbs and phrases in English. And when English is not your first language, you can be very literal. Things like someone said in high school, someone put their foot in it. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, what did they put in it? And it was just the phrase, and it's the one that really sticks to mind, because it was one of the first times that I thought, I really have a lot to learn. I've lived in quite a few places as well, and hence different cultures across my lifetime. So I think when I talk about people living in different cultures, it's not just about moving countries, it's about moving towns. There is a very different culture in Launceston compared to Smithton. There's even a very different culture between here and West Tamar Council. So I think it is a feature of modern populations, moving around, migration. Getting to learn and orientate yourself in a new community is not something new. People have to start over again with every move. And through these many moves and changes in location, you realise that the process of learning to fit in a geographical neighbourhood and to do it again and again as our circumstances propel us from place to place is one of life's most challenging lessons. I probably have another couple of moves left in me because I'll show you some photos now. This is, I'll go back first. This is my team at the Migrant Resource Centre. Very happy, smiling faces. We get to do a lot of fun things. This was an International Women's Morning Tea celebration that we held a couple of years ago. A coffee ceremony hosted by the Eritrean Ethiopian women, who are the very newest arrivals in Launceston. Dr. Frank is presenting some certificates to a group of students who had finished a netball umpiring course. Some of our graduates of our training and employment program. We took a bunch of Afghan men largely to Burnie to have a look at jobs in manufacturing. We got to do simulated welding at the Tasmania Mineral and Energies Council workshop. Launceston is home to a few thousand Bhutanese now, and in 2008 they celebrated their 10-year anniversary of settlement in Australia. That's just a photo of Harmony Day. That was last year's Harmony Day. We've only just done Harmony Day this year. We also do programs such as Learn to Swim, because many of the people that we work with had never received any swimming lessons before. And that was the award that the council gave us for the Community Kitchen Initiative. That was the Persian New Year a year ago. So we do have a lot of fun, and despite it being a challenging environment from time to time, it's more rewarding than not, and I love being there. So where to from here? Like I said, I think I have another couple of moves left to go, and we have a longing to return to farming. So my husband bought a farm, 200 acres in Sheffield. That's a before photo, because it was a forestry plantation, and they harvested it and then we bought it. So you can imagine how messy it was when we took it on. But it's inspired a lot of toys. And also some cows. So we have 10 pregnant cows, so we'll be grandparents again in a couple of weeks when they're born. And our plan is, there is no house in Sheffield, just a caravan. But one day we would like to make our way down to the Northwest Coast to be closer to our families. But my truly happy place is Stanley. We were lucky enough to pick up a house there, a shack, if you like, before the prices went up again. And we tried to go there at least every 4 weeks. And we've had that for 3 years now, and I love it. There is something that I find happiness when there's sand between my toes. And it doesn't matter whether it's winter or autumn or spring, I love going to the beach. And Stanley is one of the places you can still go where you will be the only person on the beach, depending on what time of day that you go. And it's the place that I call home. So really just to finish up, I just wanted to say My family's journey to Tasmania has been a roller coaster in some ways, but also a very good one. If it wasn't for the union between my mum and my dad, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't have been able to travel. I would not have been able to be educated in the way that I have. I wouldn't have had so many friends from different countries, and I wouldn't have experienced farm life and do things that I really honestly could not have imagined I would be doing. So thank you again for the invitation, and I hope that I've given you some insights as to what it might be like for some of the refugees and humanitarian entrants that we help, by weaving in the story of a migrant who didn't have it quite so hard, and you just multiply that by 20. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ella. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm just wondering, are there any questions people would like to ask of Ella? Wide-ranging story we've heard today, really. Yes.
I spoke aloud.
My sister,
What happened to your sister, please, dear?
she's here. She's as in Smithton, she's a nurse, and she, apart from doing a couple of years of training in Hobart, she pretty much stayed in Smithton. She's a Smithton girl, married a Smithton boy. Yes. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. The microphone's coming.
It looks like you've really created a lovely family at the Migrant Resource Centre. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on the challenges of having cultures as different as the Bhutanese and Africans within the same organisation.
Mm-hmm. Let me break that question down. It is, look, working in a multicultural environment is challenging, but also it's very enjoyable. What we find is the framework that we use working with people is a human rights framework. We don't say that we're experts in any culture, despite that we work with many cultures. What we say is, if you treat the person in front of you like you would treat anybody else, we're all the same underneath your skin. And if you don't know, ask. So we do cultural awareness training, and we are aware of some of the sensitivities within each culture. However, we're in an environment where diversity is accepted, and we make mistakes. We tumble every day with some of the things that happen to people's lives. So while there are some cultures that are a little bit more like Australians, there are different religions, different celebrations. We try to incorporate that and be respectful. And even if we don't agree, we just say this is how we treat everybody within the service, and this is how we provide those programs. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay.
And on that point, you may not know, there's a little exhibition in the community room out at the back, which is called Searching for Paradise. And it's about, it's a series of books created that represent the migrant experience and the refugee experience. And there's a very, very moving film that you can watch, which is sort of parts of the book, but also emphasises the what Australia has signed up for with the, what's it called, the refugee, the Declaration of supporting refugees and their entitlement to live without fear or their lives in danger and so on. Thank you, Ella. Are there any more questions? Sorry, I'm sort of preempting an end, but I don't mean that. If there are any more questions. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wide-ranging talk that encompassed your very personal background, but also a general experience too. And just listening, I'd like to make the point that we are so lucky in Tasmania to have people like Ella join us and to call Tasmania home. So there are no more questions. Thank you very much, Ella. That was wonderful. Could I remind you that we are, hopefully, COVID permitting, sitting in this room at this time every month for our lectures. And we've had a bit of a glitch with next month's. The person who was to talk suddenly had to pull out the day before yesterday for April. So we're still searching for April, but I can guarantee it'll be someone very, very interesting. And we're lucky enough to have Dr. Margaret Robertson in the audience today, and Margaret will be speaking in May. So we do have, that's an illustration of great speakers lined up. So I hope to see you again. And could I remind you to book? Because we may just one day have that terrible problem when 70 people plus turn up and we'll have to turn people away. So whilst there aren't many people coming, it's fine, but we're hoping to build our audience. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week, next month.